There is only one way to end this war, and that is to negotiate a deal with the Iranians. You may secure some concessions, particularly on nuclear enrichment, but you are not going to extract major ones. And when it is over, it will be clear to almost everyone watching that Iran won. That means eating humble pie. Washington would have to sit down at a table, acknowledge that 40 days of sustained bombing and a naval blockade accomplished considerably less than the public statements suggested, and make a deal on terms that Tehran finds acceptable. Right now, nobody in a position of authority is prepared to do that. That is the core of the problem. That is the entire strategic paralysis distilled into its plainest possible form. We know where the exit is. We refuse to walk toward it. And so the situation continues to slide towards something that nobody planned for and nobody fully controls. Let me walk you through how we arrived at this point, because nothing about this situation appeared overnight. These are the accumulated consequences of decisions made across decades, compounded by the operational choices of recent months. And the result is a strategic environment that is moving with increasing speed toward a state of genuine instability. The forces that are now in motion were set in motion long before the first bomb fell on Iran. Understanding that is essential to understanding why getting out is so much harder than getting in always turns out to be. Begin with China, because China is the fundamental backdrop against which everything else in this conversation must be properly understood. Going back to the early 1990s, the American economy was vastly superior in strength to the Chinese economy. There was no genuine strategic competition. We held commanding advantages across every dimension of national power: economic, military, technological, diplomatic. And what did we do with those advantages? We spent the better part of 3 decades actively helping China become an economic powerhouse. Both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration worked diligently to bring China into the World Trade Organization in 2001, and that decision alone provided the fuel for a rate of Chinese economic growth that has since become nearly impossible to reverse through any policy instrument available to us. The policy was called engagement, and it rested on a foundational belief that a prosperous China would naturally evolve into a cooperative China, that deep economic integration would gradually soften Chinese strategic ambitions and draw Beijing into the existing international order on Western terms. That belief was wrong. What 3 decades of engagement actually produced was a peer competitor unlike anything the United States has encountered in its entire history as a nation. To his credit, when Trump first entered the White House in 2017, he recognized this for what it was. He was the one who formally abandoned engagement and replaced it with a policy of containment. That was the correct strategic call, and history will likely treat it as the single most consequential foreign policy decision of his first term. But there is a significant distance between recognizing a problem with clarity and managing it with discipline. And the gap between those two things is precisely where we now find ourselves, operating in a strategic environment that demands our complete attention and receiving instead a fraction of it. China has more than 4 times the population of the United States. It has accumulated extraordinary national wealth over 4 decades of sustained growth. It has developed sophisticated technologies that are comparable to ours across most critical sectors and demonstrably superior in several that matter to the military competition. When you imagine a nation with those demographics, that level of economic scale, that degree of technological capability, operating with unified political direction and a planning horizon measured in decades, you are contemplating something the United States has genuinely never had to confront in its strategic history. Great Britain did not present this kind of challenge. The Soviet Union had the ideological intensity but lacked the economic foundation. China has both the material base and the strategic patience. We can compete. We are not standing still. But we are in a race against a rising power that began far behind us, has been closing the gap at a remarkable rate, and will likely continue to close it, absent a dramatic reorientation of American strategy. And yet, what are we actually doing? We are not pivoting to Asia. We are not concentrating forces, strengthening alliances, or marshaling resources toward the competition that defines the long arc of American national security in the 21st century. We are pivoting away from Asia, and we are doing so to prosecute a war in the Middle East that has no clear definition of victory. no viable military path to a decisive conclusion, and no exit strategy that anyone in authority is willing to state honestly. Every precision munition expended over Iranian territory is a munition that cannot be prepositioned in the Pacific. Every naval asset committed to blockade operations in the Persian Gulf is an asset that is not available for the Western Pacific contingencies that strategic logic demands we prioritize. Every intelligence resource consumed by this conflict is unavailable for the strategic competition that actually matters over the long term. China watches this entire situation with a patience and a quiet satisfaction that should produce genuine alarm in Washington. It does not appear to. Now let us address the recent summit in China directly. What was sought from that meeting? More than anything else, what Washington wanted was Chinese cooperation on the Iran problem. There was a genuine hope, perhaps expectation is too strong a word, but certainly a genuine hope, that Beijing could be brought to apply meaningful pressure on Tehran, that China's economic relationships with Iran, its energy imports, its political influence, could be converted into diplomatic leverage that would bring the Iranians to the table on terms Washington could accept. That did not happen. The Chinese made their position clear in a manner that left no room for ambiguity. They are not going to attempt to bring the Iranians to their knees. They will not try. They do not view that role as appropriate for themselves, and they do not view doing so as being in their national interest. On that central objective, the summit produced nothing. For their part, the Chinese arrived at that summit with their own central requirement, and it was Taiwan. It is always Taiwan. Before Xi Jinping had even formally welcomed the American delegation, before any ceremony, before any introductory pleasantry had been exchanged, he delivered a lecture on Taiwan. That moment should be studied carefully and remembered clearly by anyone who believes this issue admits of diplomatic hedging or managed ambiguity. Taiwan is not, for the Chinese leadership, a bargaining position. It is not a chip to be traded for favorable tariff treatment or increased Boeing purchases. It occupies a category entirely its own. No meaningful concessions materialized on Taiwan. No movement was achieved on Iran. The trade dimension of the summit produced some aircraft orders and some agricultural agreements. The type of announcements that fill a joint communiqué without representing any genuine shift in the underlying strategic relationship. A few goodies, as I would put it, not a breakthrough by any meaningful measure. And then there is the rare earths question, which may in fact be the single most consequential item on the entire agenda, and which received far less public attention than its importance warrants. China controls the rare earth materials market. They are not managing that control with generosity, and they are actively deploying it as strategic leverage against us. The consequences extend well beyond the economic dimension, though the economic dimension is serious in its own right. The strategic consequences are profound and immediate. The advanced weapons systems upon which American military superiority depends, precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare platforms, next-generation aircraft, the full spectrum of cutting-edge American military technology cannot be manufactured without rare earth materials. We are exposed in a way that is genuinely dangerous, and we have no near-term solution to that exposure. No meaningful progress was achieved on that front. When you add it all up and look at the ledger honestly, the China summit was notable primarily for what it did not accomplish. But the broader China conversation reveals something that goes well beyond the outcome of any single diplomatic meeting. Over the past decade, through a sequence of choices that each seemed defensible in isolation, we have inadvertently constructed an axis of adversaries arrayed against American interests with a coherence and coordination that did not exist before. This did not happen through anyone's deliberate master plan. It began with Ukraine. The crisis ignited in 2014, and from that point forward, the American response to events there began pushing Russia steadily toward China with a consistency and a momentum that should have been anticipated. When large-scale combat resumed in February of 2022, that process accelerated into something qualitatively different from what had existed before. And now, examining the situation in the Middle East, you find that Iran, Russia, and China share a significant and growing vested interest in working in active coordination against American strategic objectives. From Iran's perspective, the rationale is self-evident. They are the direct target of American military power, and they need all the help they can get. But from Russia's perspective and from China's perspective, the United States has positioned itself as a common adversary, and that shared adversarial relationship creates common cause where very little previously existed in such organized form. These three nations are coordinating with each other in ways that are consequential. When Putin travels to Beijing, with a regularity and a warmth that stands in sharp contrast to anything passing between Washington and Moscow, he and Xi are not conducting empty ceremony. They are working through how to manage and ultimately blunt American power projection across every relevant theater of strategic competition. The Russia-China alignment that exists today is substantially the product of decisions made in Washington, and it represents one of the most significant strategic liabilities we have created for ourselves in the post-Cold War era. Now let us return to Iran directly, because that is where the immediate danger lives. 40 days from late February through early April, we conducted a sustained bombing campaign against Iran, coordinated with the Israelis, and it did not produce the desired result. That assessment is not mine alone. It is what the American intelligence community has been conveying to the president, and it has made its way into reporting that can no longer be dismissed or managed. The damage to Iranian military capability was real, but was less extensive than the public narrative suggested. Critical systems were degraded but not destroyed, and then Iran used the ceasefire period not to capitulate, not merely to recover, but to adapt in ways that have made the military problem considerably harder. This is what every military that has ever absorbed combat pressure eventually does. It learns. Iran has spent these months studying American air operations with a seriousness and a sophistication that deserves respect from anyone thinking clearly about the operational problem. They have improved their air defenses. They have developed better methods for detecting the preparatory signatures that precede a surprise attack. The ballistic missile sites that were struck and destroyed have been excavated, rebuilt, and returned to operational status. Mobile launchers have been dispersed across wider geography, drastically complicating targeting. New tactical approaches have been developed, practiced, and incorporated. And critically, they are not doing any of this alone. Russia and China are both providing material assistance and technical guidance. The Iran that would face a resumed air campaign today is a meaningfully more capable adversary than the Iran that absorbed the first 40 days of strikes. That is not a comforting assessment, but it is an honest one. So when the conversation turns to restarting the bombing, and it has been a live and serious conversation, it is worth being completely direct about what that would mean operationally. It means returning to a strategy that demonstrably failed in its first application against an adversary that has spent months preparing specifically for that strategy's resumption, with outside powers actively helping them resist more effectively than before. That is not a formula for a different outcome. Bombing Iran a second time will not break Iranian will. It did not break it during 40 days of sustained strikes, and the conditions that might break it, internal collapse, elite fracturing, popular uprising, have not materialized. Going back to the bombs does not change that calculus. The decision to pause the planned strikes was explained publicly through a particular narrative involving Gulf state requests for additional diplomatic time. I do not believe that narrative accounts fully for what actually occurred. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, have concrete and powerful reasons for opposing a resumed air campaign, reasons that have nothing to do with abstract diplomatic preference and everything to do with their own survival. Iran has demonstrated the capability and the will to strike oil infrastructure, desalination plants, and the physical and economic architecture upon which those Gulf states entirely depend. Any nation in the region that participates in, enables, or simply permits an American strike campaign against Iran through the use of its territory or airspace places itself in the category of legitimate Iranian target. The Gulf states understand this with perfect clarity. They watched the 40-day campaign. They drew their conclusions. It is entirely possible, I would say it is plausible to the point of likelihood, that Saudi Arabia told Washington directly and firmly that American aircraft could not use Saudi airspace. If that conversation happened, and that position held, The operational architecture for a resumed campaign became severely constrained regardless of what the White House intended. That is the degree of strategic isolation that our conduct of this war has produced. We are prosecuting a conflict in a region where our nominal partners are quietly withdrawing their operational cooperation because the costs of providing it have become too great for their own national interests. And all of this feeds back into the central strategic reality that I return to repeatedly, because it demands to be said plainly and repeatedly. The United States is in a declining relative position vis-à-vis China. Not a collapsing position, not an irreversible one, not yet, but a declining one, measured by the trajectory of relative power. We began this post-Cold War period with strategic advantages that were genuinely unprecedented in modern history. Through the choices made in the intervening decades, the engagement policy that built our primary competitor, the wars of choice that consumed our resources and our credibility, the institutional corrosion that accumulated during years of distraction, and now this conflict in Iran, we have burned through that advantage at a rate that future historians will examine with considerable difficulty. Taiwan carries its own profound weight in this picture. It was seized by Japan in the War of 1894 to 1895. Every Chinese person, not the party leadership in isolation, not the strategic class, but the ordinary Chinese citizen, regards that island as sacred national territory, as unfinished history that must be resolved. That sentiment is not manufactured for political consumption. It is genuine, it is deep, and it is not going to moderate with time. The Chinese intend to close that chapter of their history. When you place that depth of nationalist feeling on top of the genuine strategic value that Taiwan represents to both sides, the standard mechanisms of rational deterrence, the careful balancing of costs and benefits, the assumption that both sides will draw back from unacceptable risk, become considerably less reliable as a basis for policy. I have spent my career studying how nations fight and how they win, how great powers manage competition across decades, and how they exhaust themselves through accumulated strategic error. The pattern visible in the current American strategic position is not a new one in history. The warning signs are not subtle for anyone who has studied these dynamics with any seriousness. What is required, and what is conspicuously and dangerously absent, is the willingness to absorb a difficult diplomatic outcome in order to redirect national power toward the competition that will actually determine America's place in the world across the next half-century. That means negotiating with Iran on terms that Iran can find acceptable, absorbing the domestic political cost of a result that will be labeled a defeat by some, and treating that cost as the necessary price of strategic reorientation. It means bringing the focus and the resources and the credibility of American power to bear on the China challenge with a seriousness that the current situation makes impossible. The only genuine exit from this war runs through a negotiating table, not through a bomb bay. That is the military assessment. That is the strategic reality. The situation has not become uncontrollable through any single catastrophic decision. It has become uncontrollable through accumulation. Each choice that seemed contained at the time, each escalation that appeared manageable in the moment, each off-ramp decline because the domestic political cost of taking it seemed too high. The Iranians refused to break. They refused to collapse under 40 days of bombing. They refused to surrender under blockade. They adapted, they rebuilt, and they hardened. And now the pieces are in motion in ways that no single actor fully controls. Iran will not capitulate. Resumed bombing will not change that. The Gulf partners are pulling back their cooperation. China and Russia are coordinating against us with increasing coherence. The rare earth exposure goes unaddressed. Taiwan remains a detonator with an uncertain fuse, and the clock on the window of American strategic primacy continues to run. That is where we are. The question now is whether anyone in authority will look at that picture with clear eyes and act accordingly, before circumstances force a far worse set of choices upon us.